He shouldn't be able to do anything. It's getting worse and worse about him.
The arrest of Andrew in February sent shockwaves through the British media, detonating like a long fuse bomb at the heart of the royal family. But just as the public was struggling to process that bombshell, a figure from the past has stepped forward. A former royal protection officer who served for years at Royal Lodge, Prince Andrew's residence. What he describes is chilling. Behind the grand gates of Royal Lodge, life was far from the glamorous image the public imagines. The ex-officer, referred to here as Page, paints a picture of constant tension, where security personnel endured outbursts of rage, verbal abuse, and open contempt simply for following standard protection protocols. Many say that when the internal phone rang from Andrew's quarters, the entire guard post braced for an incoming storm. Page even suggests that King Charles repeatedly tried to rein in his younger brother, but those efforts failed against Andrew's increasingly stubborn and extreme behavior. Now, in the wake of Andrew's dramatic downfall, whispers inside palace walls are turning to hope for a different future, one under King William, where royal discipline and order might finally be restored. But what exactly did staff at Royal Lodge endure for years while serving Andrew in silence? And is his collapse the wake-up call the monarchy needs before William ascends the throne? Before delving into the dark corners of Royal Lodge, Paul Page must be mentioned. He was no ordinary guard, a veteran officer of the Royal Protection Squad. Page had devoted more than 6 years of his life, from 1998 to 2004, to shadowing the most powerful figures in the United Kingdom. His job went beyond stopping bullets. It was about preserving the flawless facade of the monarchy. Page observed with the cold, precise, disciplined eye of a realist. In the early 2000s, Andrew still held the position of Queen Elizabeth II's most indulged son, a hero forged in the 1982 Falklands War. Yet behind the glamour of a naval pilot lurked a man perpetually wrestling with wounded pride and an innate temper. Their stage was Royal Lodge, the stately residence nestled in Windsor Great Park, where the serenity of manicured lawns was routinely shattered by sudden thunderclaps of rage. Mornings there did not begin with birdsong, but with a heavy dread settling in the chests of security officers as they scanned the Duke's schedule. For Paul Page, protecting Andrew was not an honor. It was a psychological ordeal. He had stood guard for the Queen, escorted princes, but no one else could turn the surrounding air into a minefield, primed to explode, as Andrew did. The most emblematic incident unfolded on a late afternoon in 2002. While the nation leaned toward unity inside Royal Lodge's gates, another silent war erupted. When a group of Andrew's guests approached without clear identification, Page's junior officers did their duty. They halted the vehicle and demanded verification. It was the ultimate security protocol, the final barrier safeguarding lives within. But to Andrew, that protocol was a personal insult. Paul Page still remembers the piercing ring of the internal phone shattering the security room's silence. It was not a call, it was a shockwave. The prince's voice crackled through the receiver, unleashing the crudest words, the most direct insults aimed at the honor of men in uniform pouring down like acid rain. Andrew bellowed, demanding they open the damn gate right now and stop delaying his guests for even another second. Standing before the monitor screens, Page watched the young officer's hands tremble on the handset. It was not fear of physical assault shaking him, but the tremor of dignity trampled by the very person they had sworn to shield with their lives. Andrew did not see them as living shields. He saw them as irritating obstacles, insolent servants who didn't know their place. Andrew's behavior went beyond verbal tirades. He wielded his power like a leather whip. Page had witnessed the Duke storm out the main door, face flushed crimson with fury, striding toward the guard post, simply to vent over some trivial delay in arranging transport. The look in the Duke's eyes held none of the warmth the public saw on television. It carried only cold contempt for those beneath him. Fear seeped into every corner of the staff. Page saw housemaids hold their breath before entering any room where Andrew was present. A toxic atmosphere spread, where loyalty gave way to resignation and the desperate hope of not becoming the next target of his wrath. Paul Page felt a bitter contradiction rise within him. He had been trained to defend the institution, to protect the nation's symbols. Yet as he watched Andrew through the security room glass, he realized that the symbol was being tarnished from within by sheer arrogance. Every time Andrew phoned down to breach security rules, he did not merely break protocol, he stripped meaning from the work of soldiers like Page. Page sighed. A sour thought echoed in his mind like a silent prophecy. In this place, amid proud ancient walls, iron rules applied to everyone except those who had made them. And that blind privilege, he sensed, would one day become the spark that set everything ablaze. The weeks that followed at Royal Lodge brought no peace. On the contrary, the atmosphere felt like a guitar string stretched to breaking point, waiting for the slightest tremor to snap. Paul Page began to notice an ominous pattern in Prince Andrew's outbursts. They were no longer random explosions, but had evolved into a deliberate method of asserting absolute power over the uniformed men tasked with protecting him. Every time the internal phone rang in the security room, a jolt of tension raced down the spines of the officers on shift. They exchanged glances, none wanting to be the one to pick up, because the voice on the other end was rarely issuing an official order. It was usually unleashing a torrent of crude abuse. Andrew seemed obsessed with erasing every security barrier for his personal guests. To him, the idea that a friend or business associate should have to stop the car, produce identification, or wait for clearance from the duty room was a direct affront to his own prestige. The peak of this arrogance came on a gloomy afternoon when a young officer, newly transferred to the security detail, stubbornly followed protocol to the letter. He refused to press the button to open the electronic gate when an unfamiliar vehicle approached without prior notification from the private secretary's office. That correct decision ignited a psychological earthquake. Within seconds, Andrew appeared on the balcony, his face contorted with fury. This time, he did not bother with the phone. He charged straight down to the courtyard, taking long, menacing strides toward the guard post. Paul Page watched from a distance, eyes narrowed, at the sight of the prince jabbing a finger inches from the young officer's face, lips quivering with unrestrained shouts. The act breached not only personal space, but also constituted a public humiliation. Page saw the young man's shoulders sag, his face drain of color beneath the peaked cap as he struggled to maintain a rigid posture while being berated with language that should never have passed the lips of a senior member of the royal family. The toxicity of the working environment began to seep deep into Page's mind. He realized a terrifying silence had settled over the entire residence. Housemaids, gardeners, and even seasoned officers all learned to stare at their shoes whenever Andrew passed. They mastered the art of walking on eggshells, reading his mood from the way he slammed a car door or the speed of his stride down the corridor. Blind obedience took root, not out of respect, but out of sheer survival instinct. During a late shift change, as darkness cloaked the ancient oaks of Windsor, Page sat in a shadowed corner of the break room with a longtime colleague. In the faint haze of cigarette smoke, the man whispered a truth everyone knew, but no one dared name aloud. The reason Andrew could run rampant, disregard every rule and every member of staff without consequence, was the Queen's blind favoritism. She saw him as her golden boy, the war hero returned from the battlefield, and was always ready to forgive his minor flaws of character. That revelation hit Page like a bucket of ice water, chilling his faith in the system he served. He began to question the fairness of the institution to which he had dedicated himself. Behind all the slogans of honor and discipline lay a dark corner where a mother's indulgence could shield every misdeed of her son. Protection from the very pinnacle of power had rendered Andrew untouchable within his own home, turning the security team's every effort to uphold protocol into a meaningless farce. Paul Page stood alone on the gravel path, gazing at the brightly lit windows of Royal Lodge. He no longer felt like a proper protection officer. He felt like an unwilling witness to the fracturing of a dynasty. The question of whether to remain silent or speak out began to torment him. Could a royal system built on the fear of those below and the cover of those above ever truly endure? The following months at Royal Lodge passed in a deceptive calm, the thick, heavy atmosphere that precedes a major storm. Paul Page noticed a terrifying shift in his colleagues' demeanor. They no longer complained, no longer debated Andrew's unreasonable demands. Instead, a craven silence enveloped the security team. Whenever the Duke's figure appeared in the main hall or behind the tinted glass of his SUV, the guards instantly straightened their posture, eyes fixed forward but minds blank, striving to become as invisible as possible. This submission stemmed not from respect but from sheer exhaustion of self-preservation. Page observed that even the most seasoned officers began swapping shifts to avoid facing Andrew during his most volatile hours. They would rather confront external security threats than absorb the negative current radiating from the very person they were sworn to protect. To Andrew, the silence of those beneath him seemed like victory, a tacit acknowledgement that his authority stood above every operational rule of the palace. The conflict reached its breaking point one misty morning before the fog had fully lifted from the Windsor meadows. A group of protection officers on routine patrol crossed paths with Andrew at the entrance to the private area. For no specific reason, simply because their presence interrupted his train of thought or irritated his eye, the prince halted and unleashed a barrage of vicious insults. He stood there in the open space, publicly degrading uniformed men in full view of passing gardeners and housemaids. Paul Page stood not far away, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He saw raw shock etched across his teammates' faces. This was no longer a workplace reprimand. It was the trampling of the dignity of men who had devoted their lives to safeguarding their family's safety. An invisible but sacred line had been crossed. Page realized that if he remained silent any longer, he would not only betray the uniform he wore, but also become complicit in the moral decay festering at the heart of the monarchy. Page's mind became a battlefield of clashing thoughts. On one side stood his oath of loyalty and the unspoken code of absolute discretion among close protection officers. On the other, revulsion at the daily psychological violence unfolding before him. The final decision came to Page on a late-night shift as he sat alone in the office, facing blank report sheets under the dim desk lamp. He knew reporting directly up the security chain was futile. Such complaints were routinely blocked or softened before they ever reached other members of the royal household. Page resolved to take a daring step, one that amounted to professional suicide. He would write an official report and send it straight to the highest levels of royal management, targeting Andrew's misconduct head-on. Each word that appeared on the page under the faint light represented a trade-off. The page detailed every incident, every insult, and the severe decline in morale across the protection team. The act of signing his name at the bottom brought an odd sense of liberation, a strange lightness, as though he had finally shed a crushing burden, even though he knew he had just opened the door to an unequal fight. When the envelope containing the report was sealed, Paul Page looked out the window toward the brightly lit rooms of the main palace. He had thrown a stone into the still pond, and no matter how large the ripples grew, he knew there was no turning back. Paul Page's report did not explode like a bomb. Instead, it seeped through the layers of the royal administrative machinery like a cold, underground current. When the lines describing Andrew's rudeness finally landed on Charles's desk at Clarence House, the atmosphere in the residence seemed to sync with them. For Charles, the information brought no surprise. He had long been intimately familiar with his brother's impulsive nature, but the systematic quality of the abuse directed at the security team in Page's account forced the heir apparent to confront a harsh reality. Andrew was becoming a festering sore at the heart of the monarchy. Charles's mindset at the time was a complex tangle of brotherly responsibility and the duty of a future king. He saw in Andrew not merely a spoiled younger sibling, but a potential security and public relations liability. The private meetings between the two brothers at Royal Lodge afterward carried none of the warmth of family. From his distant security post, Paul Page could observe the tension etched in their body language. Charles usually arrived looking pensive, hands clasped behind his back, walking with slow but determined strides, while Andrew maintained a defensive posture, his face twisted with wounded pride. In those discreet exchanges, Charles tried to subdue his brother's raging fire with calm reason. He reminded Andrew of their position in a changing world, where privilege no longer served as an invincible shield against wrongdoing. Yet Andrew's response was only denial and fury. Whenever he was called out on his treatment of staff, he interpreted it as a personal attack on his authority. He regarded himself as the victim of rigid rules and the envy of those beneath him. The rift between the brothers deepened when Charles delivered what amounted to an ultimatum. It was a decisive move to protect the image of the crown. Charles hinted that if Andrew could not rein in his behavior and continued to create disturbances at the security gates, his continued presence at Royal Lodge, the very symbol of the Queen's favor, might come under review. The threat struck hard at Andrew's ego. Being forced to leave the residence was not merely a housing issue. It represented a humiliating demotion in the royal hierarchy. Rather than come to his senses, Andrew chose to sink deeper into silent but venomous resistance. The calls down to the security room did not decrease. On the contrary, they took on a sharper edge of sarcasm and defiance. Andrew seemed determined to prove that, as long as his mother remained on the throne, his elder brother's warnings were nothing more than whispers on the wind. He continued to demand that procedures be bypassed for his friends, continued to berate officers over imagined slights, as though to reaffirm that the small kingdom within Royal Lodge's gates remained under his absolute control. Watching all these developments unfold, Paul Page felt a terrifying sense of deadlock. He saw Charles leave those meetings with a weary, disappointed expression, while Andrew returned to his endless cycles of rage. The former silence of the system had now been replaced by an underground war between the two most powerful men in it. Page realized that both his own efforts and Charles's warnings were crashing against an impenetrable wall of arrogance. The air at Royal Lodge grew more suffocating than ever. Suspicious glances, hurried footsteps, and the persistent ring of the night duty phone served as constant reminders that the storm had not abated. Standing in the shadow of the porch, Page gazed toward Andrew's still-lit study window and wondered silently how long it would be before this pressure cooker finally blew, when even the last threads of brotherly counsel had proven utterly powerless. Time passed, but the cracks at Royal Lodge were never mended. They were merely blanketed under layers of willful neglect until tremors from the outside world began to topple the last defensive walls. Paul Page, now observing everything with a bitter calm, recognized that the sporadic outbursts of rage at the security gates had been mere ripples foreshadowing a media tsunami surging toward them. Prince Andrew's reputation, the one he delusionally believed he could safeguard by berating staff, started to unravel under the weight of grave allegations tied to shadowy associations and official misconduct. The atmosphere inside the palace shifted palpably. Gone was the tension born of direct verbal abuse. In its place settled the suffocating hush of smoldering shame. The morning newspapers laid out on the stone table in the duty room no longer carried stories of the Duke's official visits or economic ventures. Instead, bold black headlines screamed of investigations and names from a murky past. Page watched Andrew retreat deeper into the residence. His footsteps hurried, his gaze dodging the long-lens cameras lurking beyond the perimeter fence. The everyday arrogance had given way to the cornered animal instinct of panic, laced with stubborn denial. Those who had once served under Andrew, who had once held their breath through his rudeness, underwent a quiet but profound psychological shift. Former fear slowly hardened into cold anger. In the shadowed corners of the kitchen or the security break room, stories of staff mistreatment began to circulate in hushed tones, a way to release decades of pent-up resentment. Page sensed a fracture running through the loyalty of the entire system. When a principal no longer possessed moral standing, those tasked with his protection no longer saw reason to guard the ugly secrets they had witnessed. The collapse reached its zenith in February 2026, a dark milestone etched into the modern history of the British royal family. Paul Page still recalls the visceral jolt when the official news broke. Prince Andrew had been arrested on suspicion of serious wrongdoing during his time in public office. This was no longer an internal dispute or a warning from Prince Charles. It was the hand of justice reaching through gates once deemed inviolable. The sight of police vehicles not arriving to protect, but to execute an arrest warrant, rolling into the palace grounds, delivered a visual shock to everyone who witnessed it. Through the monitor screens, Page saw the once imperious prince standing motionless in the main hall, face ashen, pride utterly shattered beneath the unanswerable weight of evidence. The furious calls down to the security gate from years past had fallen silent, replaced by the rustle of case files and the chilling quiet of investigating officers. The crisis spread like spilled oil, transforming Royal Lodge from a royal residence into the epicenter of an international scandal. Media swarmed every entrance, camera flashes exploding like lightning in the night. To experts and the public alike, this represented the monarchy's gravest crisis in decades, a threat to the very survival of the institution. But to Paul Page, it was the moment truth lay bare. He saw the downfall of a man who had convinced himself that royal blood could wash away every sin and every act of brutality. In the dimness of the duty room, Page looked back over the years with an odd sense of relief. The reports he had once submitted, the warnings from Charles that had been ignored, all of them had converged at this inevitable end. He understood that no matter how splendid the crown, it could not conceal internal rot if the one wearing it had lost the bare minimum of human dignity. The storm of scandal had swept through, leaving a ravaged royal house in its wake. Yet perhaps this devastation was the necessary cleansing before a new chapter could begin. The vanity and the final howls of rage had finally receded, giving way to an eerie stillness that settled over Royal Lodge like a shroud. Paul Page stood by the window of the old guard post, watching the police barrier tape slowly peel away, leaving a vast emptiness in his mind. What had unfolded in February 2026 was not merely a legal event, it was the collapse of a smug monument. For Page, the first sensation that crept into his chest was not triumph, but a profound relief. Like a diver finally breaking the surface after an endless, suffocating breath held at the bottom of a pressure-filled ocean. The truth, long buried beneath velvet drapes and iron rules of silence, now lay stark naked under the pale English spring sunlight. Page watched the official vehicles slip quietly out of the grounds, carrying thick files that held the darkest corners of one man's life. He thought of Andrew, the man who once treated the internal phone like a scepter for dispensing fear, now perhaps facing a different kind of silence, the silence of isolation and public judgment. The thunderous rages of the past could no longer stop the relentless wheel of justice or the merciless winnowing of the age. In the days following the upheaval, the palace's operational structure began to shift, quietly but decisively. Paul Page sensed a faint new current of life stirring through the ancient corridors. The younger security officers no longer stared at the floor in resignation. Their eyes were beginning to reclaim the confidence of men who enforced the law rather than the whims of an individual. The fear that once bound obedience here had dissolved, replaced by a cold awakening to duty and transparency. Page's thoughts turned to the future, to Prince William steadily approaching the throne. In the young heir, he saw an entirely different bearing from the previous generation. A calm steadiness paired with steely discipline and a genuine grasp of integrity's worth. Page believed that when William ascended, the ghosts of cover-ups and blind privilege would find no refuge. The royal structure he had always longed for, one built on transparency, where respect flowed both ways between protector and protected, no longer seemed a distant dream. Standing on the boundary between a turbulent past and a hopeful future, Paul Page slowly unclipped the security badge from his chest and laid it on the wooden table. The gesture was gentle, yet carried the weight of farewell to a dark era. He felt no regret for having thrown the first stone into the still pond. Without that disturbance, the rot would have remained forever hidden beneath the glittering surface. Andrew's arrest might be a wound to the royal family, but for men like Page, it was the bitter medicine required to salvage the honor of a dynasty. Page stepped out through the gates of Royal Lodge without looking back. He knew the recent upheavals were merely the opening act of a long journey of reconstruction, one in which transparency would supplant shadows and discipline would replace arrogance. The years of enduring abusive calls, contemptuous stares, and unrelenting tension had come to an end. Paul Page drew a deep breath of the fresh Windsor air, convinced that the British monarchy would eventually reclaim its stability and peace, but this time founded on truth and genuine dignity. After finishing the story, in your opinion, is Andrew's downfall the inevitable consequence of an individual's arrogant personality, or the fault of a royal system that has indulged privileges for far too long? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.